Good morning, or afternoon or evening, depending upon when you're watching this. It's just a thrill to be with you. There's not a group in the world that I'd rather try to contribute to the influence of than the people assembled here and participating wherever you may be. Leadership is intentional influence. Yesterday, Bill described how leadership means getting people from A to B. Well, that can't happen unless people change their behavior. And here's the problem. So often we think about leadership just as a motivational aspect. In fact, it's far more than that. Our ability to be effective as leaders isn't just about motivating, it's also about us acquiring competence to do so. Courage is an important component, as Bill described yesterday. Inspiration and vision are essential. But unless that translates to changed behavior, we fail. So what you and I need to be doing if we want to be effective leaders is studying from those who understand influence. Let's take a look at a few. If you want to understand influence, you need to understand how things like this are happening. So human beings spend 3 billion hours playing online games every week. Why? Because whoever's designing those games understands influence. And unless you and I unpack what it is about that activity that is engaging people to the tune of 3 billion hours per week, we won't be able to do our jobs well. Second example, 7 million people in the United States, 1 in 34, are incarcerated or under the supervision of the correctional system. Why? Because influence systems are driving that behavior. We aren't locking more people up today, far more people up today than we did 50 years ago because people are different. It's because the influence environment you and I inhabit has changed profoundly. And unless you and I understand how it's changed and learn to use that in favor of people's positive change, we won't be true leaders. Worldwide obesity, as we know, has doubled since 1980. Now, why are people eating differently? That's a behavior, that's an action. Leadership is intentional influence. And those who want us to eat more, who have economic incentives to do that, have developed wonderful strategies to help this to occur. Well, on a more positive note, smoking rates, at least in the United States, have dropped from 44% to 21% since 2008. Why? That's because there are people who understand influence. If you can cut smoking in half, there must be something for you and I to learn as influencers embedded in that wonderful outcome. So here's the deal. We know how to get people to log in, lock up, eat up, but not light up. We figured out how to do that. And so you and I ought to be taking lessons from this important field of social science because after all, leadership is intentional influence. So let's take a look at our track record from an evangelical perspective. In 2007, 61% of Americans said religion is losing influence. Well, if we're moving to video games and out of church pews, there's a reason for that. And you and I ought to understand the mechanics of that. 80% of people say, I know a Christian, and yet only 15% say they behave differently. Now, we could have lots of doctrinal discussions, and many of you are the experts on that, but from a social science perspective, I would say if our religious experience isn't translating to different habits and behaviors, then we aren't leaders. We haven't influenced. So what can we learn about influence? I want to take you on a journey through the social sciences. I'm going to try to share with you a way of thinking about this class of problems that we call influence problems. And what I hope to accomplish in the brief time we have together is to give you a repeatable, learnable, intentional way of designing influence strategies, whether it's to improve safety or customer service or client retention in your business, or whether it's to help people put religious concepts into practice and translate them into the fruits of a religious experience in our lives. I want to do that by anchoring it to a real story. So let's take on an influence problem. This is a woman named Jane and Jerry, somebody I met in the Mathare slum about 5 years ago. This is one of the most dangerous slums in the entire world in Nairobi, Kenya. Jane's story. Jane was walking me through the Mathare slum and showed me the about 15 by 15 foot little hovel that her family grew up in. She described how at age 10, she had 6 siblings and 2 parents, all in this 15 by 15 foot little tin shack with a leaky tin roof. She said as she started to approach puberty, her father began to sexually assault her. So she had a terrible decision to make. Do I stay here and put up with this, or do I throw myself out into the open world where I have no means of support? She chose to leave. She said there are options depending on your sex in the Mathare slum. If you're a young man, you usually go into theft. If you're a young woman, the only real viable option, at least from her perspective, is the sex trade. So here she is, a 12-year-old girl having been sexually assaulted, exiting this 15 by 15 foot slum dwelling, and choosing to become a sex worker because no other options were available. She said, now I had 2 potential strategies. One was to ply my trade with the tourists, where the fees could be a little bit higher. The other was to stay closer to home, but within a couple of years, I had a couple of children as a consequence of my work and had to worry about childcare. So I wanted to stay closer to home. I want to tell you, my friends, that I wept openly in the middle of the Mathare slum when I asked her about the economics of that decision. It turned out that her choice to stay in the slum meant that she was selling sex services for 25 cents. 25 cents. I have 2 daughters. And it just broke my heart to think that anyone's daughter would ever have to make that choice. Now, what shook me to the core then was pulling the lens back and realizing that in just the Nairobi area, there are 800,000 Janes. So let's take this on for a moment. Let's say you wanted to influence change. You wanted to help the Janes of the world. Let's just say that was the problem you wanted to take on. Well, the question becomes, how would you influence her prospects? Now, we're not going to quibble about this, but I'll share with you some research that suggests that if we could get Jane to practice one simple behavior regularly, it would profoundly change her life. That vital behavior, as we call it, is making and keeping weekly commitments to increase her income and savings. So if we could just engage her in that activity regularly, what we know is not only do her financial prospects improve, but her sense of worth, her psychological well-being, the safety of her children, her sexual autonomy, her health status, many different things improve if we can engage her in that one regular behavior. So now, step back. You're influencers. How would you do that? How would you help 800,000 Janes get engaged in that kind of behavior? This is where influence comes in. Now, I'm going to move that aside for a moment, then we'll revisit it a number of times. I want to take you to some laboratory experiments so that we can develop a model, a way of thinking about influence. So at our labs, a couple of years back, we brought a whole bunch of munchkins together, a bunch of kids, 6th and 7th graders. We wanted them to be old enough to understand money and be motivated to some degree by it. So we brought a number of children into the lab, and we gave them an opportunity to earn $40 by completing 4 simple tasks, $10 each, over a period of 10 minutes. So easy money, simple tasks, brief amount of time. And we hoped that they would save their money to go do something useful with it later. In order to help them save their money, we asked them to anchor their commitments to some goal. So listen in as they describe what they want to do with their money.
Well, I was wanting to get a new video game, maybe a new pair of shoes.
College money.
Wait till Christmas comes and then buy my sister a really cute outfit.
So they got a goal, right? They've all got something to anchor their intentions. Now the question is, how did they do? Now remember, 4 easy tasks, 10 minutes, $40. The only temptation we offered them was the opportunity to buy things at what we called our Change Anything store. So we set up a little table, and we had goods priced at 5 to 10 times what these kids knew you would pay in the store. So not a temptation at all. You'll see, for example, a candy bar available for $10, right? Or a tiny little hard candy for $2. So all these kids knew this was not a particularly good deal. How did they do in dealing with that modest temptation? Let's have a look. Bummer. Well, let's look at the statistics. Out of a potential $40 in savings, the average person took home $13. Now, not a good outcome. We were absolutely blown away. They spent like crazy. In fact, some of the kids went into debt in a 10-minute period of time. Now, you and I can sympathize. So the question becomes, why? Why? Now, here's the problem. You and I, particularly with a religious perspective, so often believe that the reason people do what they do is because they lack commitment, they lack resolve. We describe these as personal motivation problems. This is a naive view of the world. And in fact, what it causes us to do is when somebody fails, we deliver another sermon, which often isn't what's needed. So Jane makes a commitment to make and keep small commitments to improve her incomes and savings, and she fails. What do? Do we give her a motivational talk? Well, we do if we don't understand influence. So what I want to do is unpack that experience. I want to pull back the curtain and show you what we did to these kids, but first I want you to test whether they were aware of what we did. So we asked them to explain their failures. Listen to their explanations.
I don't know. There was like a lot of good stuff to buy. I'm not sure if I can answer that question.
Neither am I. All right. So they're baffled. Why did I do this? I wanted to save, and I've got no money left. What happened to me? Well, here's what happened. And this is where you need to start taking notes, because there were intentional influence systems put in place, the same that Jane is subject to as she goes out to try to keep the commitments she made to increase her income and savings. First of all, as each of the kids came in, we gave them a taste of their favorite candy. We did what psychologists call putting them in a hot mode. We wanted them in a hot, impulsive mode. So we just gave them a little taste, and here's a free sample of what you have available on the table. Second, we gave them no skills, so we put them into novel circumstances, and we didn't skill them up to deal with some of the novel challenges that they'd face. Third, we subjected them to social influence. So you'll notice how the model is organized. These are the repeatable, learnable, intentional sources of influence. They embody all of what the social sciences have been repeatedly demonstrating for the past 70 years about why you and I do what we do. A large reason is because we're socially motivated or socially enabled. In fact, to the degree that you and I are naive about how profound these sources of influence are. Let me show you how modest the intervention was from a social perspective. All we did was get accomplices, confederates, in at least the control condition, to come in and make a small statement, a small suggestive statement to the subject at the point that they were observing the store.
There's a lot of awesome candy over there. Too much.
That's it. That's it. A guy in a red shirt saying, dude, right? That's all it takes. Source 5, we tried to manipulate structural incentives as well. All we did here was say, just spend as much as you want, we'll deduct it from your earnings later. We gave him a credit account, gave him a credit card. Would that make a difference? Sixth, we surrounded the room with decorations. The decorations were pictures of children enjoying candy. Just gave them a few little cues. And what happens? $40 goes to $13 in 10 minutes. Now, this wouldn't be particularly compelling unless we had an experimental condition, right? So as good scientists in the room, what you ought to be asking is, all right, well, if you change those, would behavior change? Well, let's do it. So let's, on the first case, from a personal motivation perspective, let's not put them in a hot mode. No taste of the candy. We're going to remove that. Second, we'll just give them a 60-second little practice opportunity for how to keep track of your savings and spending so you can keep a mental tally. Third and fourth, we'll ask those accomplices, those confederates, to take a different role. We'll just give them a different phrase to use.
I'm going to save my money. How about you? I think I'm going to save my money. I think it'd probably be a good idea.
Again, modest little invention, kid I've never met, babbling about saving his money. Would it have an influence on me? Source 5, We're going to take them off the credit account and pay them in cash. That way, as they surrender the cash, they'll experience the loss. And 6, we're going to take down the wallpaper. So what happens if all of those change? Let's have a look. Now, anecdotally, it looks like things were much different. Let's look at the data. So whereas the kids in the first condition walked out with $13, those in the second condition walk out with $34. This isn't a modest difference. This is a 270% difference. You know, in academics, we can get a PhD for finding a 5 to 10% difference in behavior. This is huge shifts. So if we've got 800,000 Janes that we want to influence, how do we think about that problem? Here's the takeaway. Leadership is intentional influence. What we know is that if you amass a strategy that includes all 6 of those sources of influence, people change. That's how it works. The reason this wonderful gathering that you're a part of has been so phenomenally successful is because whether intentionally or not, or whether through trial and error, it's become a wonderful expression, a brilliant expression of every one of these sources of influence. And your outreach, your ministry, your leadership in your businesses, to the degree you include the same, will succeed to the same degree. So what I want to do is walk you slowly through how to think better about each of these sources of influence. Now, we're going to move quickly, so don't panic if you don't feel like you deserve a PhD in each of these areas by the time we're done. What I'm hoping this does is invite you into more intentional learning about each of these sources of influence and an opportunity for you to go back to your business and back to your churches and examine your ministries, your outreach, your worship experience from a perspective of all of these sources of influence and see to what degree some are missing. Now, I'll anchor this in our story of Jane. Part of what took me to Nairobi was studying this organization, an organization started by Ingrid Munro called Jamii Bora. It's been phenomenally successful in working with over 250,000 Janes and helping them change their lives in a substantial way. Now, the first problem you've got, if you're trying to do that, is the personal motivation problem. Here's the issue. Personal motivation problems are those where the good behavior feels bad and the bad behavior feels good, which is almost every problem in the world. So the problem you and I are up against as influencers is the bad stuff often feels personally gratifying, satisfying, pleasurable to people, whereas the good stuff feels like sacrifice, burden, struggle, effort. And if that's what you're up against as an influencer, my question to you is, how do you think about solving that problem? Well, let's take a case in point. A friend of mine, Brian Wansink, did a little experiment on Halloween, the holiday in the United States where we give out candy to children, pandemonium. On his front porch, he put a big bowl of delicious candies, chocolates, and yummy flavors of every sort. Next to that bowl, he placed a bowl of apples. And he allowed the children with no human present to choose which of those two they would like. In the control condition, isn't it embarrassing that on Halloween you have control conditions? This is what social scientists do. In the control condition, the two platters were set there, and only 9% of the kids, fewer than 1 in 10, took the apples, probably because their parents were watching. The other 91% did the normal thing. They took the candy. So here's the question. How would you, in a non-coercive way, influence more children to take the apples? Here's the problem. You and I tend to believe that behavior has intrinsic emotions associated with it, feelings and sentiments, experiences. It doesn't. Bad behavior can feel good or bad. Good behavior can feel good or bad. Your job as an influencer is to help the good stuff feel pleasurable and the bad stuff feel bad. It's to make the world right. How would you do that? Well, let's look at what Brian did. In the experimental condition, he did one simple thing that shifted the number of kids that took the apples to 48%. Over 5 times more kids took the apples. What did he do? He put a picture of Batman on the front porch with a little sign under it that said, "What would Batman eat?" 5 times more kids take the apples. Well, what does this teach us? What influencers understand is that people can profoundly change the way they feel about almost any choice. Choosing to stay chaste, choosing to go to church, choosing to contribute tithes, choosing to be faithful to your spouse, choosing to go the extra mile for a customer. Those can feel intrinsically pleasurable if they're framed the right way. Your job as an influencer is to influence the frame. Make sure that we don't just teach principles and abstract ideas, connect them to people's values. Second, help people frame the specific choices they're making in godly ways or moral ways or value-based ways. That's your job. If I see this as a choice of being like Batman, I feel differently about eating that apple, and it tastes different than if I see it as an issue of doing what my mom told me to do. The two are significantly different. So what do they do at Jami Bora? Jane comes in, and they don't say, you need to save money and you need to increase your income. They ask Jane, what's your aspiration? What's important? Jane, without making eye contact, looking at the ground, embarrassed to even admit that she had a dream this big, said, I would like a dignified home for my children. I would like a safe place with a roof that doesn't leak, and a separate bedroom, and a place to go to the bathroom indoors. That's my dream. Now, when Jane begins to work on increasing income and increasing savings, it's anchored to that. A colleague from Yale, Dean Carlin, found that if you ask people to start a savings account, they don't save nearly as much as if you call it a new roof account or a new home account. Just the frame changes my experience of the behavior. So that's the first task. Now, there's lots to learn about how you can help people feel a sense of connection and motivation about behaviors, but we need to move on. Second, the second domain opens up a whole world, particularly for those of us that teach in a religious context, that are influencing there. I want you to just experience something. This is a young girl by the name of Zia Terry. She's 10 years old, and she's about to go down her first 40-meter ski jump. 10 years old. Fortunately for us, she has a helmet cam on, so you and I get to live the experience with her. I want you to listen to that experience and then ask yourself from an influence perspective, what just happened? And why is it so profound? Okay, have a look.
Be fine. I'll do it. Well, here goes something, I guess. Okay, you can do this. I'm gonna jump.
You got it.
Whoa, my ski's slipping off.
Just remember, never snowplow, okay?
No snow plows.
Keep it straight and you'll be fine.
Okay.
Keep going fine.
Straight. Do you go faster on the end run?
A little bit.
A little bit?
Yeah.
Is it any steeper, do you think? Not much?
Same steepness, it's just longer.
Well, just longer. Just longer. Just a bigger 20, that's all.
Yep.
It's a bigger 20. Go ahead. I got it. It's fine. You'll be fine. Okay. Here. The longer you wait, you'll be more scared. I go. The first time freaks me out. That's the only thing, it's so fun! Huh? 60 seems like nothing now.
Now, what happened there? Clearly that was influence, but what was going on? What happened is the one thing that you and I are the most naive about. as influencers, what we understand is that motivation is a big part of change, but we miss the entire right side of the model. What you and I don't get is ability is a profound factor in influence. In fact, those whom we've studied across the world over the past 30 years who are the most effective at influence start on the right and move left. They don't start with motivation, inspiration. They start with ability. They start with skills. They start with removing barriers. That's where they begin, and then they move left. Yesterday, Pastor Bill talked about Joshua's prayer. Be strong and courageous. Well, you know what God did for Joshua prior to putting him in those circumstances? He had him spend 40 years with Moses, learning, watching, studying, developing skills. What did he do for Moses? He had him raised in Pharaoh's court, where he learned to understand how to administer large and complex operations, integrating lots and lots of people. Skills are a substantial part of influence. And they're throughout the Bible when we start to open our eyes to how God influences people's change. But you and I tend to believe that motivation and inspiration is what's required. What happened with Zia? Zia had the perfect enabling, the perfect efficacy experience. If you and I want more influence, we need to involve people in far more experiences of deliberate practice. What's deliberate practice? This is hands-on practice under realistic conditions. The practice setting has to approximate the real world. Here's the problem. I sit in your sermon, I get lots of great ideas, but you know what? Here in church does not resemble the real world. And when I go back home and my kids are out of control and my wife resents me for traveling too much, I'm not trying to be too real here. And I'm in an emotionally bad place and I'm about to lose my temper and be a very bad father or husband. That's the real world. And if you want me to increase my capacity to practice healthier behavior, what you have to do is help me practice under fairly realistic conditions. Zia had the chance to do it in small bites with a lot of feedback and coaching for brief periods of time. That's the ideal context for skill acquisition. Organizations that thrive, that do a tremendous job developing a healthy culture, spend an enormous amount of time with coaching and feedback under fairly realistic conditions. So the big point here is open up the whole right-hand side of the model. What does Jami Bora do? They have classes. They don't just say you need to increase your income and your savings. They teach about financial literacy, but not just about cognitive elements. They teach about emotional control, impulse control, and goal setting, and how to shift your emotions in crucial moments. So Jane gets the opportunity not just to build aspirations, but to develop the skills to achieve those. Next, sources of influence. Let's take on another problem. Go to a whole different domain. State of Washington put in brand new high occupancy vehicle lanes, right? Lanes that you can only go in if you have how many people in your car? 2 or more. Let's read the sign. Good. So you can only use those lanes if you have 2 or more people. The problem was that within just a couple of weeks after announcing the new lanes, they found that at least 1 in 5 cars were cheaters. People with how many in the car? Just 1. So the question for them as influencers was, how would you change that behavior? You and I tend to lean on coercive sources. We tend to say more cops, right? Public executions, bigger fines, you know? That's the way to do this. Well, they didn't have the money or the political power to pull something like that off, so they came up with a modest little intervention. And embedded in it is a powerful lesson that in spite of the brief time we'll focus on it, I hope you'll extrapolate on it, reflect on it, and carry it home. What was the intervention? They wrote 3 letters. Just wrote 3 letters and then posted a sign. The sign said, report HOV lane violations by dialing 921 HERO. You gotta love it, don't you? Yeah. I mean, there's a whole discussion we could have about that, but let's look at the driver perspective. So here's what happened. I'm driving on the freeway. I've got 3 people in my car, but you're up ahead of me with only 1. So I call this number and I report your license plate. They figure out your address and they mail you letter number 1. Letter number 1 is accompanied by what they call an educational brochure. And the essence of the letter is one of your fellow Now, it doesn't say that, but you and I know how it would feel. The letter says essentially somebody spotted you in the HOV lane. You had only one in the car. Apparently, you don't know how to read. So here's a brochure to educate you about. And that was all it was. There was no threat. There was no fine. There was nothing else, just a letter. Now, if people reported a second time, they got a second letter, this time from the Department of Transportation, the third time from the State Patrol. But again, never with a fine, never with a threat, only a reminder that somebody saw you. Now, let's break this down. Because it worked. It worked. The number of lane violators dropped by 80% in a matter of weeks. So what's going on here? Well, the first time I'm driving along, right, and I look over there, and that lane is going so fast, and I think that would be so fun, right? So I move over there, and I'm moving along at 10 miles an hour faster, and my life is good. But then I get this letter in the mail, right? Now, the next time I'm on the freeway and I'm looking over there, guess what new thought is in my mind? Yeah, they're watching me. I've reframed this from an economic or a strategic decision to what? To a social one. To a social one. People don't like me when I do this, and those are the people right there. So, what happens? Behavior shifts. Now, if you look at the 6 sources of influence, you notice 3 and 4 talk about social motivation and social ability. You have to learn to employ these. In a business context, we do the worst thing in the world. We take people out of their social setting, out of their team, away from their boss, drop them into a training experience, give them lots of great ideas, and then put them right back into the same social system. Guess what happens? Yeah, they don't use anything. The same can happen with our church experience, with our worship experience. We're in a wonderful supportive social setting here, but then you get picked up and dropped out somewhere else. What I heard Pastor Bill describe yesterday that I think is profound and important and an expression of this is this notion of having section pastors and developing social capital and finding ways to encourage and support each other on a continuous basis. What do they do at Jami Bora? Well, we don't just invite Jane in. We surround her with friends and coaches. She's got colleagues who are equally interested in increasing incomes and savings. How does that work? Well, one of them she sat next to was this woman. Her name is Mary Meudy. Mary Meudy is an entrepreneur extraordinaire. I put her up against any of our Silicon Valley pros. She was in the middle of the Mathare slum, had no income, 4 children to support. Her husband had abandoned her. And she finally started thinking of herself as a business person in the context of what Jami Bora did with her. So she said, I need a business idea. She looked around, realized everybody else is selling mangoes and bananas. I can't do that. I need to differentiate myself. So she also needed to do it on very little capital. She looked around and found that the people that were killing chickens to sell their meat would always cast off the head and the neck. They'd pull the neck meat out, but there was a little pile of chicken heads and necks that were just cast off. She approached those people and said, could I have those? They said, yeah, take them away. Save us the trouble of carrying them off ourselves. She asked, what about the entrails? Do you need those? No, have at them. She carries off entrails, chicken heads, and necks. She purchases a few pots and pans with a loan that she gets from a microcredit organization. She cooks up some potatoes and some onions, some spices, and throws in the entrails for a little extra protein. Then she stuffs that in the neck, sews it up, boils the entire thing, and has a portable, highly nutritious, protein-rich food that you can eat out of the beak. It was brilliant. It was brilliant. Any of you ever use a Pez dispenser? You know, it's kind of, I don't know, kind of like that, but. I said, do you make a profit at this? She said, oh, yes, I do. I said, what are your costs? She said, loaded costs? She has the skills. She sells every one of these that she can make every day. She sells them like hotcakes, and they taste like chicken, right? And that's who Jane is sitting next to, and 10 other people like that. Think about what kind of influence that would have. Now, wrapping this together, the last 2 sources of influence, structural motivation. We have to look at the effective incentives, and I don't have time to talk in detail about that. But Jami Bora understands this. There are incentives for getting loans, for increasing your savings. You can get a better interest rate if you have a larger amount of savings available. If you've repaid a number of loans, then you're also able to acquire greater credit with the organization. So there are incentives for increasing income and savings. Another supportive influence strategy. Finally, the sixth source of influence I want you to experience. So take on this influence problem. I want you to imagine that you are going to try to come up with a way of influencing people in Las Vegas to use the stairs rather than the escalator. So first we're going to show you the video of the control condition. So we put a time-lapse photography system at the bottom of the escalators and stairs. I want you to count up over a period of an hour how many people take the stairs. Have a look. At least going up. How many did you get? Yeah, a couple? Okay, so a couple. So that's our baseline. The question is, how would you influence them to take the stairs rather than the escalator? Now, I hope what starts to happen as you let this idea sit in your mind is you learn how to take apart influence problems. You ask yourself, could we develop a personal motivation strategy and frame it differently? Could there be a skill issue? Could we use social influence or incentives? But what we did was more modest than all of those. All we did was install a cue. Most people, when making a decision like this, follow the crowd and are in a fairly mindless state. We wanted to jar them into alertness and just give them a chance to make a choice. So at the bottom of the escalators and stairs, we posted a sign that said, "Want to burn 7 calories?" And then put a little arrow to the left. Watch what happens. Isn't that remarkable? Just a sign. You know, who would have thought? You and I are so naive sometimes about what shapes our choices. Just having pictures of candy on the wall, just having a kid in a red shirt say, "Dude, you ought to buy a lot." These little things nudge us in ways that you and I grossly underestimate. What's the sixth source of influence? It's the influence of space, data, cues, tools, processes, environmental factors. The space we inhabit affects our choices. Look at the design of your home. If you want to understand why your kids play more video games and read fewer books, look at how the house is designed. You know, what's enshrined, what's at the center, what's convenient, what has comfortable chairs associated with it. There are structural factors that influence our choices, and you and I need to learn how to use these to make bad behavior harder and more conscious, and good behavior easier and more obvious. Cues, tools, surroundings. Again, take a look at the Willow Creek process that you're embedded in here. How many cues and tools and reminders have been made accessible on Facebook and Twitter and with tangibles. So much of that is a really critical part of the success of this effort. So, what does Jamii Bora do? They create a different environment. They have little centers in the middle of the Mathare slum, little islands of isolation and separation that Jane can experience. But they also use other little tactics and tools. I can tell you Jane was profoundly affected the first time she brought home a passbook, a savings passbook. And the physical act of going in and having her savings incremented and watching that increase cues and reminds and enables her to continue to engage in that kind of activity. Record keeping is a huge part of their influence strategy. So, what's the point? The point is this. These 6 sources of influence aren't something you and I get to vote on as leaders. They're just there. They work either for us or against us. And if your influence strategy involves just motivating people to go change, but leaves the other 5 untouched, that means they're working against you rather than for you, and you will lose. People won't change. That's why we have 3 billion hours spent on video games, because people have figured out how to get all 6. In fact, we published one of our studies that demonstrated that when people use all 6, your odds of success don't go up modestly, like the difference between $13 in savings and $34. They go up 1,000%. The odds of success go up tenfold. You want to change the world? Learn how to change behavior. Learn how to do it the way Jamii Bora does. I spent that day with Jane. We walked through her old home and stomping grounds. It was one of the most dispiriting experiences I'd ever had, just thinking about the pain that humanity was experiencing in this one place and realizing it was just one of many. But later that afternoon, we had a different experience, an experience that was one of the most heartening, one of the most inspiring that I've ever experienced. We went to her new home. It was dignified. It was safe. It had a roof that didn't leak. It had a bedroom for her and a different one for the children. And in fact, it had an open area where her 4 employees work on a daily basis. We brought her some housewarming gifts and we celebrated the moment with her. And I asked her, Jane, what was it like? I said, 2 days ago when you moved in, the first moment you stepped across that threshold. And she started to tear up. She was overwhelmed with emotion. She said, I dropped to my knees. And I said, dear God, when did a woman like me ever get a house like this? And then I looked up at a little tin sign on her wall that expressed the same way she had. God can, it says, bless you from nothing to something. And while touched by the sentiment, I had kind of a silent rejoinder. I thought, oh no, Jane, you're wrong. You were always something. All you needed was the influence environment to allow you to realize and express that. That is our job as leaders. Leadership is intentional influence. I hope this discussion with you today blesses and enhances your capacity to exercise that for the wonderful goals that you have. Thank you very much.